So good morning from Canada, and good afternoon, good evening, and good 3 o'clock in the morning if you're where Sui Bang is. Welcome to this session 9 of Dialogues, Challenging Embedded Coloniality in Music History Curricula. I'm Margaret Walker. I'm at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And as people join us, people are introducing themselves in the chat, but I'd also like to invite you into a very informal survey in the form of a Menti word cloud. And I'm going to put the link into the chat right now. And the question is very, very simple. What do you think of when I say music history? So don't filter, don't think, oh, what should I say? Just what's the first thing that comes into your mind? And I'm also going to share the QR code if that's easier for some people. Oh, now I've lost it again. You think I'd know how to share a screen by now, after all? After all this online teaching I've been doing. Here's the QR code if you'd rather use your phone, but you can also just access it from the chat. So yeah, don't filter, first word that comes to mind. So while you're all doing that, I'm going to stop the share. I'll let you know something about the three of us. We are three Canadian scholars from different places in Canada. I'm professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, which sits on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Linda Pearse is from New Brunswick. I'm an associate professor at Mount Allison University, which is located on the unceded territory of the, I just lost myself here, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And Sandria Bouliane is a professor at the Faculté of musique at Université Laval and the Ville de Québec, which is situated on the territory of the Huron-Wendat people. So we are each from different fields of music study. So we bring a variety of approaches to our own dialogue between the three of us. We're a sort of emergent research team. And so we bring those different perspectives to this dialogue here. I'm an ethnomusicologist who has specialized in the history and historiography of Indian classical dance, the dance called Kathak. Linda comes from a very extensive early music performance background, and Sandria's research focuses on French Canadian vernacular and popular music. But what's brought us together is not just shared interests in interdisciplinarity and intercultural transfers and entanglements, but the fact that all three of us have ended up teaching core music history courses at our institution, in spite of not being traditional musicologists. And another interest that unites us is, of course, decolonization. And because of our work, its manifestation in university music history curricula. So let's take a look at that word cloud and see what's come up. And then we'll go on with the presentations and the discussion. Okay. This doesn't work unless I share my screen first. All right, so biggest word, classical music, Beethoven, music history, Western Europe, Western art music, Western classical music, Mozart, the big Beethoven, little Mozart, composers, and so on. So you can continue typing into that if you like. But I think what we're going to invite you to do is to think about music history a little bit differently than that. And Carlos, if you'd like to run the three presentations, I'd be very grateful. 2 weeks ago, at the first symposium for the ICTM study group for Global History of Music, the panel that I chaired began with 2 papers on how to teach global history of music. These were not ostensibly about decolonization, but as I listened, I was struck again by the need when working with any type of disciplinary or, more important, social change, to include the classroom, because the students there will one day be teachers, scholars, or performers themselves. We three in the panel believe fervently that the process of decolonization of music and dance studies must be engaged with both at the academic or theoretical level, but also at a practical level in our courses and curricula. Now, I'm not going to go deeply here into decolonial or anti-colonial theory. I'm sure many of you know these even better than I do. But it's useful to begin with a few key terms to center our papers. One of the clearest definitions of decolonization that I've come across comes from our Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University. Decolonization, as the Center for Teaching and Learning, can be productively understood as the removal or undoing of colonial elements, whether they are material, philosophical, epistemological, educational, all kinds of things. In relation to this, indigenization can be embraced as the addition or redoing of indigenous elements, including, again, epistemological, ontological, structural, spiritual features. Obviously, any attempt at indigenization needs to be done in conversation with Indigenous people, local Indigenous people. But you know, the colonial side is my story. So colonialism can sometimes be dismissed as an event or a condition of the past, a different time and place. But it's the concept of coloniality, the long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, to quote Nelson Maldonado Torres, that remain embedded in so many of the world's structures and systems that is more often relevant. It can be easy to apply the terms colonial and decolonization too widely. And as Eve Tuck and Kei Wen Yang crucially remind us, decolonization is not a metaphor for other social justice improvements that we want to do in our teaching. Rather, they remind us firmly that decolonization has to be about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. But figuring out what this is going to look like in a classroom is pretty tricky. But it has been addressed, thankfully, by Dylan Robinson, who's put forward that relinquishing control of the curriculum, allowing space for Indigenous ways of thinking and being, can be a powerful and appropriate way of returning ground in educational contexts. To return to music history, the curriculum taught in the large majority of North American, British, European schools and conservatoires dates from the late 19th century. German scholars, including Philipp Spitta, Heinrich Schenker, and Guido Adler, promoted academic or scientific music study through a focus on score analysis removed from social context. Guido Adler, in his 1885 article, The Scope, Method, and Aim of Musicology, drew on concurrent methodologies in the natural sciences and explained music history through a framework of artistic evolution, marked by stylistic eras identified through observable changes in musical language. This was much like biologists at the same time were observing and documenting evolutionary changes in fossils embedded in successive layers of rock. During the same decades, Adler and his contemporaries were also collecting and publishing the monuments of music, the nationalist collections, and the first complete works of editions of composers like Bach, then Handel, and they did Palestrina, Beethoven, Mozart. The influential Paris Conservatoire included its first music history requirement in 1871, followed very closely by the Bachelor of Music program at Oxford, which followed suit in 1872. Finally, books of music history dating from the end of the century, for example, Emil Naumann in 1886, reflect this work in presenting a teleological narrative of music's evolution from primitive origins through various stages of development to arrive at the art music of composers like Hector Berlioz and Richard Wagner in the mid-19th century. The musical stages are marked by great works and composers, the same masters and masterworks collected in the Monuments and Complete Works editions. Nota bene, the context for all of this, the 1850s to the 1890s, was a time when European colonial occupation covered most of the globe. The music history textbooks we use in the early 21st century are strikingly similar to those narratives of the 19th century. Together, they disseminate a ubiquitous narrative about music history with problematic characteristics that can often seem invisible and unrecognized. The standard narrative is Eurocentric. It's called music history, but it's not music history. It's not the history of music, but rather it's very specifically the history of the elite concert music of Europe and its diasporas. It's canonic. It has included essentially the same composers and many of the same works since the 1870s. It's evolutionary. A key feature is that the narrative traces the progress, the development of European art music through these successive eras, marking its increasing sophistication and expressive profundity. It is embedded. In universities, this narrative is woven through music theory, performance, oral skills, solfeggio, ensemble training, everything, as well as music history. It's also white supremacist, as its unexamined persistence, in addition to its ideas of cultural evolution, sends a message of European exceptionalism and superiority. Why else would university music study concentrate so relentlessly on this one particular type of music? The answer seems to be because we think it's superior to all other types of music. The three of us come from Canada, where this focus on European elite music has a particular colonial context. Canada is a settler colony on stolen Indigenous lands and a constitutional monarchy with the British Crown remaining as our titular head of state. Canada is officially bilingual. France and England have been historically considered as the two founding nations, but English is by far the dominant language. As a settler colony of the Americas, Canadian history is built on an Indigenous, settler, enslaved triangle. This, of course, is the same as the United States, our large neighbor to the south, although it is said that Canada has oppressed Indigenous peoples while erasing the presence of Black peoples, while the United States has oppressed Black people while erasing the presence of Indigenous nations. Settler Canadians up into the mid-20th century were largely, although not entirely, from Europe, but more recent migrations have created an increasingly multicultural population. Yet, European elite music is hegemonic. Major cities all have symphony orchestras, concert halls, funding agencies privilege elite music and dance, white elite music and dance. The Royal Conservatory of Music School and National Examination System train children and adult amateurs across the country in Western classical music and its canonic narrative. And the Canadian University Music Society was created in the 1960s to celebrate and foster the homegrown composers and works of this imported culture. So the problem here is we, who teach music history courses in higher education in Canada, are teaching a 19th century teleological narrative that not only privileges elite white culture and largely male creators, but also positions it indisputably as more worthy of serious concentrated study than any other music in the world. We do this in colonial institutions in a settler colony where this music is imported but then presented as our music. So what can we do? What are some possibilities to relinquish control, even return ground, in our teaching of music history? My colleagues are going to address this in much more specific detail than I am, and I'm also really looking forward to our discussion. I hope to learn a lot more from all of you. But here are some possibilities. One can build around historiography and critical theory. A crucial step to decolonization is identifying and then calling out this narrative as exclusive, elitist, even white supremacist. Some faculty members may find themselves in teaching situations where they cannot change the canonic content, but alerting the students to who wrote this history and in what context can at least accomplish something. We can include local music histories, and I would say especially the music and history of Indigenous peoples whose land your university is on. Global music histories is another approach, because one very pernicious concept is that only European elite music has a history. Many university curricula teach Western classical music as history and then everything else as culture. Global music history is emergent, there's no textbook, but some ways of approaching it are through local music histories. So the local music, but also how it's influenced by global forces, and probably how it in turn has influenced those global forces. Parallel music histories is a way of introducing music in a few different places during the same time period. We have to really be aware of comparison, and I explicitly warn my students, don't compare. But linking through a theme often works really nicely. And then finally, entangled music histories, which I love. I love the word, I love the concept of histories that come into content and influence each other, sometimes in friction, sometimes in harmony. Until the 19th century, of course, the canonic history of Europe usually pretends that there are no other influences in European music, and of course there are. So it sounds awfully easy when I list these, but there are some very real barriers to own and then grapple with for us. The first is simply the embeddedness of the European supremacist narrative. I was completely enculturated in my teens and 20s. I went to the Royal Conservatory of Music, a community school, then the professional school, and I was a member of the College of Examiners for 20 years. And in spite of all the work I've done on coloniality and the system, I can still find myself worrying that I can't leave anything out. My students are going to be bereft if I don't do Gretchen am Spinnrad or something. The second is the ubiquity of canonic teaching materials and models. Eurocentric textbooks, music examples, scores, online teaching resources not only dominate the publishing houses, the material that is available and not about Western classical music is also usually not about history. There's also that big bug, preparation time. Yes, there is material out there. It's not in the textbooks, but the scholarship is out there, and there's an increasing interest by musicologists in global and local histories. But finding this material, researching it, sussing it out, and then converting it to teaching material takes a huge amount of time. Also, just pivoting from what we were taught, have been teaching, know so well, requires a sustained effort. That goes back to the embedded point as well. It can often just seem easier to teach the canon, and so much of the time we're so busy. Student expectations can also be a very real concern, especially if you're contingent, including pre-tenure. This is not what I came here to learn. I've read not infrequently on my student evaluations, my course evaluations by students. Also, if the students are really resistant, get really grumpy about this, how much of the decolonial, anti-colonial history are they really going to learn? The narrative, as we know, is embedded in everything else they're doing in a music program, so they're going to learn it anyway. This musical myopia is aided also by the audition requirements in most music programs. Students are only accepted after proving their ability in Western art music performance. So most of our students are already shaped by the narrative when they arrive in our classrooms. Finally, both students and professors may well find themselves far out of their comfort zone. And while the students may be able to retreat back into the familiar territory when they leave our classroom, any professor dedicated to challenging embedded coloniality in music history teaching needs to find a way of embracing this discomfort. Thank you. And now on to Linda Pearse.
How do we address the barriers to an inclusive pedagogy in the art music history classroom? My practice reflects that intellectual and pedagogical discomfort are necessary facets of crossing liminal thresholds in music teaching practices, particularly those that aspire to move beyond canonic content to generate new narratives and to challenge the old. I will consider the practical application of theoretical levers, those that Margaret elaborates in her presentation, to the reorganization of an early art music history course. I describe my process, how I established learning outcomes, goals, and how I modified structures, which led then to changes in the theoretical framework, the content, and eventually my pedagogical approaches. I briefly compare two iterations of the course, one from 2020 and the more recent in 2021, and I articulate changes in framework and content, reflecting on my own experiences and discussing the results and possible directions moving forward. I considered scholarship on EDID, equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, together with recent scholarship on music history pedagogy. I also engaged in provocative conversations with Margaret Walker and seminars in musicology at McGill University that introduced me to critical race theory and post-colonial and decolonizing theories. These sources illuminate systemic biases, and they suggest the need for syllabi that reflect a more equitable and diverse approach to higher education. I also bring to the table my experiences with intercultural collaboration as a performer and artistic director, and my desire to adjust my own teaching practice. Despite the growing awareness of issues surrounding EDID and in a lot of disciplines and fields, post-secondary music programs within Canada are sometimes firmly rooted in Eurocentric musical traditions, what we only half-jokingly call the Great White Man approach. Applying a historiographical lens, Lydia Gurr's imaginary museum of musical works is helpful for the way it explains how an embedded structure, what she calls the work concept, can govern classical music practice by way of a regulative concept. So regulative concepts, when deeply embedded in a practice, they are stable and invisible, and they become transcendent, absolute, and self-legitimating. And it is this invisible structure and operation of the canon that explains the discomfort we encounter as music pedagogues when we attempt to engage meaningfully with EDID in a history classroom. So the theoretical writings vastly outnumber those describing practical approaches. And so today's contributions I'm making in the spirit of continuing the practical side of this conversation. So I consider a first-year undergraduate required course for BMUS students that focuses on Western European art music prior to 1750. It typically considers written musical traditions, genres, forms, and key terms. As my starting point, I thought about learning outcomes. So I wanted students to critically engage with early European music within its cultural context, including a consideration of gender and colonialism. As well, I hope that students would develop an awareness of the historiography of early music, so how the story of music is created, how narrative and language shape the way we value musical scores and performance. The new learning outcomes led to two goals: to devise ways to reshape or deconstruct received historical narratives, and to commit to an engagement with EDID. These goals suggested two key areas of restructuring. First, adopting threshold concept theory as a way of engaging the liminal concepts of historiography, gender, and colonialism. And second, I aim to include at least 50% content by other composers and musics, and to more seriously embrace oral and improvised traditions. Although there is a canon of works established for the study of early European music, you're not bound to it in the same way you might be if you were teaching like a 19th century art music course where Beethoven, Schumann, and Brahms, they loom large. It's fairly easy, for example, for me to consider early women composers, different types of improvisational or oral musicking, and to engage with colonial expansion and its musical implications. Threshold concepts are described as core ideas that are conceptually challenging for students. But in theory, once they're understood, these ideas transform the student's perception of the subject. A few of the key characteristics are described as troublesome, transformative, and irreversible. To be sure, gender colonialism and historiography are perfect examples of troublesome and potentially transformative concepts for students to grasp, particularly when they are new. Threshold theory emphasizes process over outcomes as a pedagogical practice, and it lends itself to repeated application within different contexts. For example, in this course, the threshold concepts provided a kind of a touchstone that we return to over and over again. For example, the lens of colonialism was applied to the consideration of Spanish sacred music that was performed in early colonial Mexico in the late Renaissance. And then colonialism was brought back again later in the course to explain in part how France could afford such lavish opera houses and court entertainments, and to consider representations of other cultures on French opera stages in the 18th century. There are 3 stages of threshold theory: preliminal, liminal, where you're crossing the threshold, and postliminal. They can be difficult to identify and can occur at different times for each person. So I learned to connect liminal space with a sense of discomfort. For example, when I felt and resisted the desperate need to swap out one of the new to me topics with something more canonic and familiar. The 2020 course included just 5 works by women composers, comprising just 21% of the total course content. I decided to alter that with the aim to instigate new narratives and expose embedded narratives that might not be visible, and to test the received narratives and see how and if they change with the altered content. Here's the 2021 course with its 50% EDID content, and you see 6 works by women composers, 3 works plus several chants from non-European locations, a disability topic, music from specifically colonial locations as well. So I retained a mostly chronological format, which was hard to give up, but I wove non-traditional and traditional topics close together, hoping to spark connections. I located some new content through my searches, but was also really supported by generous colleagues and mentors who made recommendations. Juliet Hess borrows theoretical models from gender studies, identifying the musician as tourist model that adds other musics to a curriculum centered on a Western core. This model positions Western music as normative and other musics as marginal. Hess argues that this presentation of other musics becomes superficial because they appear cosmetic and like embellishments that just come and go without a lot of impact. She recommends instead aiming for a comparative or relational model, imagining that the curriculum could function as a complex web in which neighbors dialogue and in which music is understood as a social practice. Yet when I went looking for examples of such practice, I did not find many. Robin Attis, however, did this type of work in a music theory classroom, noting her discomfort and identifying it as essential to her teaching. This discomfort described by Attis resonates with the discomfort of liminality that I learned about in threshold concept theory. Sandria's presentation will consider pedagogical strategies in an EDID-focused classroom, but I share a few ideas here that I used for course assignments. The students had flexibility with content and time management. So, for example, they had a 5-day window to complete assignments, and they could choose their own adventure by just doing 3 out of 5 assignments, and they could decide which tasks or questions they would answer. So the assignments allowed for a deeper dive into EDID topics, but it also allowed students to choose which directions they were most interested in, so they didn't do all of them. Inputs included and combined videos and lecture segments, music listening, and short scholarly readings. So some texts from ethnomusicology, musicology, theoretical readings, and cultural studies, as well as score analysis. And outputs and activities included written reflections, breakout discussion groups, the creation of a blog or wiki page with the choice to work in pairs or alone, and a multi-staged paper project. The assignments were crafted not only to deepen knowledge, but to encourage students to demonstrate their understanding of threshold concepts. For example, students reflected on the difference between medieval understandings of musical disability and their own. The broader variety of content and the reduction in canonic works taken together with the tightly woven format meant that the class repeatedly addressed the threshold concepts in a kind of spiral-like manner. So students spontaneously began to compare women's roles and experiences within class discussions and their papers. We considered women's music making in both sacred and secular contexts in the medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods. So their critical engagement with gender deepened over the arc of the course and went beyond historical biography and well into critical frameworks. For many students, I would characterize this engagement as post-liminal. but gender is a concept with which many of the students were already familiar with prior to taking the course. And gender was the most present EDID aspect within the course. So this intensity of engagement and post-liminal status is perhaps not surprising. With historiography, the engagement seemed to reach liminal space, though not for all. Some students critically engaged with historiography within class discussions and in several papers and assignments. So they were able to question the assumptions of different authors and point to other questions that arose from the readings. So they demonstrated an awareness of authorial perspective or bias, and this awareness bled through to some other papers as well. With the concept of colonialism, however, engagement did not meaningfully cross a liminal threshold that was visible to me anyways, except maybe in one case. Though the students, they wrote to me with questions about colonialism after class, there was just this general crickets Zoom silence and a reluctance to engage in conversations about it. And in part, this might be due to the public and virtual teaching space. So I consider this engagement as pre-liminal. Granted, colonialism was a new concept for most students. Given that I only seriously addressed the framework 3 times during the course, this result suggests that I will need to intensify engagement in order to cross a liminal space, a space that seemed much more accessible to students with the concept of gender. Not surprisingly, student papers in the 2021 course demonstrate a greater engagement with the threshold concepts and areas of focus than the 2020 iteration. More students wrote about improvisation and gender and colonialism than in prior years. So that was a change. In addition to our standard surveys, I added 4 questions using a Likert scale to get a sense of the value that students assign to EDI learning. Unfortunately, only 30% of the course participants actually completed the survey, so the sample size is far too small to do anything with. But I also taught a second-year survey course this semester, and I compared the results between the classes. So the second-year students who responded valued EDID in their course more consistently than the first-year students. And now I want to know if a shift of values occurs as a result of their university education, or if this shift is not a shift at all and just a coincidence. A little bit of reflection now. Venturing away from the canon elicited equal parts excitement and fear on the part of the instructor. For example, when I had relegated Giovanni Gabrieli's polychoral music, which is a standard of the canon, and it's some of my favorite music to teach, when I moved Gabrieli's music to the position of an optional assignment, I felt a strong urge to switch it out with the music in colonial Mexico that had become part of the required content. In conversation with a student, however, I was told that the Gabrieli music just doesn't look that interesting. They like the pretty floral designs on the Mexican part books. So I felt as if I'd jumped off a cliff, hoping that the water below would be deep enough, but the students didn't seem to mind at all. And this seems to be a key takeaway. For whom are we carrying on the canon? Certainly not the students. Are we recreating the canon to serve our own needs or to link ourselves to a historical pedagogical tradition? Are we taught as teachers to implement the system and narratives that we received as a measure of teaching success? A further reflection is that more work was required than I had anticipated in restructuring the course. So it took a lot of time to think in new ways, do new research, and engage emotionally in leaving behind old habits. I learned a few things. First, that using threshold concepts was a threshold concept for me as an instructor. And second, that we need to expect and recognize liminal discomfort as some kind of marker of change and perhaps success. Taken together, this experience raises some questions. So how can I deepen the application of threshold concepts, particularly those that might be new to students, such as historiography and colonialism? And in a post-pandemic environment, which I hope we are in very soon, the inclusion of experiential learning opportunities might provide such a path. I can also imagine going beyond the 50% EDID content and building in more music that connects with colonialism. That might strengthen the experience. I will surely continue working with Margaret Walker and Sandria Bouliane on our larger project, and I anticipate that understanding the complicated and messy nature of liminality from both student and instructor perspectives might point the way to new pedagogical techniques and activities. Thank you very much.
Bonjour, Cette troisième présentation va se dérouler en français, mais mon support visuel est en anglais et vous serez les bienvenus de poser des questions dans l'une ou l'autre de ces deux langues à la fin de mon exposé. Ma présentation aborde des aspects plus pratiques. Il sera question de pédagogie, d'activités d'apprentissage, et puisqu'il s'agit de la troisième présentation d'affilée à laquelle vous assistez aujourd'hui, eh bien, je vais adopter un mode de présentation plus dynamique, informel, voire improvisé. D'entrée de jeu, j'aimerais insister sur les opportunités qui peuvent se présenter à un professeur ou un enseignant et qui sont des occasions à saisir pour amorcer un processus d'ouverture et de décolonisation de nos cours. Alors, ces occasions peuvent être des révisions, des créations de nouveaux programmes, ça peut être la création de cours, l'arrivée d'un nouveau professeur ou encore un projet de refonte d'un programme ou d'un cours. Mes deux collègues qui m'ont précédé, Margaret et Linda, ont déjà insisté d'une part sur l'importance des assises théoriques à partir desquelles on peut avancer notre réflexion épistémologique de manière à développer une approche de décolonisation des cours d'histoire de la musique. D'autre part, il a été question de manière d'intégrer donc des contenus plus diversifiés, ouverts, pour amorcer et poursuivre ce processus de décolonisation. Aujourd'hui, moi, je souhaite nous diriger vers l'enseignement lui-même, donc vers les méthodes d'apprentissage aussi et d'évaluation qui ont un rôle vraiment très important à jouer, de même que les étudiants. Alors, j'insiste maintenant sur l'importance d'amorcer la discussion avec les étudiants, soit dans le cadre de rencontres en classe ouverte ou encore par le biais de sondages anonymes. À l'été 2019, alors que j'arrivais comme nouvelle professeure à l'Université Laval, on m'a demandé d'entreprendre une refonte des cours d'histoire de la musique occidentale. J'ai décidé de commencer par effectuer un sondage avec l'aide de mon auxiliaire de recherche Sarah-Anne Arsenault, donc un sondage auprès d'étudiants et d'anciens étudiants à propos des cours d'histoire de la musique. Plusieurs questions leur ont été posées, bien sûr, mais j'aimerais attirer votre attention ici sur trois d'entre elles concernant la place qu'ils accordent dans leur formation et leur vie à l'histoire de la musique. 71% disent attacher une grande ou une très grande importance aux connaissances acquises en histoire de la musique dans le cadre d'une formation universitaire. Toutefois, ils ne sont que 66% à dire que les cours d'histoire auront une grande ou une très grande importance pour leur future profession. Cela dit, ils sont 84% à accorder une grande ou une très grande importance à l'histoire de la musique du point de vue de connaissances générales et d'un point de vue personnel, donc de bagages importants à acquérir, non seulement au cours de leur formation, mais aussi en tant qu'individu. Pour le dire autrement, ce 84%-là nous révèle qu'une grande majorité d'étudiants, eh bien, ont un intérêt et des motivations personnelles envers les cours d'histoire de la musique. Et voilà une occasion, professeurs que nous sommes, de nous appuyer sur cette motivation-là pour du même coup entreprendre une transformation qui va viser à rejoindre chacun de ces étudiants-là dans ce qu'ils peuvent aller rechercher de plus profond et personnel dans les cours d'histoire de la musique. Cette approche, eh bien, mérite d'être faite selon l'équité, diversité, inclusion et décolonisation, donc le ADID process, présenté plutôt par ma collègue Linda Pearse. Alors, en raison de cet intérêt, de cette motivation-là, eh bien, nous avons le devoir de faire en sorte que les étudiants puissent participer donc à ces changements-là en utilisant des approches de pédagogie active qui sont tout à fait en cohérence avec les plus récents développements du côté de la philosophie de l'enseignement. J'entends aussi ici par pédagogie active une manière de faire en sorte que les étudiants puissent ensuite adapter le cours à leur propre programme en se basant sur des connaissances aussi préalables qu'ils ont et qui puissent s'assurer eux-mêmes de faire en sorte que le cours puisse être le plus profitable pour la profession qu'ils désirent exercer ensuite en musique. Il y a plusieurs ressources à notre disposition pour tenter de penser ou repenser notre pratique pédagogique dans le cadre de cours d'histoire de la musique. En voici quelques-unes. Plusieurs de ces auteurs vont poser la question à savoir, eh bien, à quoi servent les cours d'histoire de la musique au niveau postsecondaire. Eh bien, plusieurs vont aller dans le même sens que Thomas et Regelski en supposant que les cours d'histoire de la musique se distinguent des autres cours de la formation en musique parce qu'ils permettent aux étudiants de mieux se connaître comme individus et de mieux comprendre le monde dans lequel ils évoluent, un monde qui est extrêmement multiple et diversifié et qui est changeant aussi dans le temps, et que les cours d'histoire peuvent être un moyen de refléter donc cette réalité-là dans laquelle ils vivent dès qu'ils sortent du contexte de la classe. Alors, quel est justement ce contexte de la classe d'histoire de la musique? En fait, et ça c'est donc primordial pour entreprendre ensuite des activités en classe et des activités donc d'évaluation, c'est de toujours bien situer notre approche. Mes collègues ont déjà évoqué certains de ces éléments, mais toujours de faire sûr que les étudiants vont comprendre qu'en tant que professeurs, nous ne sommes pas les dépositaires de tous les savoirs. Nous n'avons pas la vérité, à savoir qu'est-ce qui doit être appris et qu'est-ce que l'étudiant devrait savoir par cœur plutôt qu'autre chose. Donc, d'être transparent avec les étudiants, comme quoi que nous allons proposer une vision parmi plusieurs de l'histoire de la musique et d'indiquer quelles sont nos contraintes avec lesquelles on doit donc construire et fabriquer notre cours. De toujours aussi bien se situer, donc de dire qu'on prend un cours qui va adresser la musique selon une perspective qui peut être géographique, temporelle, culturelle. Elle peut aussi croiser ces différents ancrages-là. Donc, il faut aussi bien le clarifier auprès des étudiants et peut-être encore davantage leur faire bien comprendre que la réalité est complexe, que l'histoire de la musique ne peut pas se réduire à un seul point de vue, il en faut plusieurs. Il faut entendre plusieurs voix aussi afin de pouvoir offrir un portrait qui soit riche et non réducteur. Certaines précautions peuvent être prises pour s'assurer que ce que nous souhaitons accomplir avec notre programme de cours d'histoire de la musique qui soit plus équitable, diversifié, inclusif et décolonial, et bien pour que ça puisse bien fonctionner en interaction avec les étudiants. D'entrée de jeu, il faut s'assurer d'avoir donc un climat de confiance et de respect qui soit établi dans la classe afin que tous les étudiants, peu importe où ils en sont dans leur cheminement, dans leur réflexion, eh bien qu'ils se sentent accueillis et écoutés. De leur faire comprendre que c'est normal s'ils vivent parfois de l'inconfort et qu'ils peuvent bien sûr en tout temps venir en discuter et pouvoir l'exprimer. Certains étudiants auront besoin de plus de temps ou de plus d'accompagnement lorsqu'un cours adopte une approche d'histoire globale ou décoloniale. Et cette démarche-là peut se réaliser en deux temps. Dans un temps d'abord individuel, donc l'étudiant avec la matière du cours, avec des lectures ou des écoutes ou différentes ressources qu'on peut lui partager, mais aussi en groupe, à la fois entre pairs, entre étudiants, mais aussi avec l'accompagnement donc du professeur pour participer à éveiller les consciences, donc de devenir plus conscientisé sur différents enjeux sociaux qui touchent souvent l'ensemble de la classe ou du moins le monde dans lequel on vit. Troisièmement, j'insiste sur l'approche critique. Donc, de toujours rappeler que les histoires sont plurielles, qu'il y a une historiographie, oui, qui explique la construction d'un canon, mais que cette historiographie-là, aujourd'hui, avec une révision critique, demande à être remise en question. Et donc, pourquoi est-ce que le canon existe et pourquoi il est nécessaire de le réviser? Eh bien, de toujours rester clair avec les étudiants de ce en quoi ça consiste. Et c'est à partir de ça qu'il nous sera possible de développer des activités qui vont permettre d'ouvrir les espaces, d'accueillir différents types de ressources, qu'elles soient universitaires, qu'elles soient communautaires et autres, tout ça au sein de la classe d'histoire de la musique. Passons maintenant aux activités d'apprentissage. Certainement que plusieurs de mes suggestions que vous avez déjà exercées vous-même dans vos cours, ici l'idée c'est de voir comment elles peuvent vraiment nous aider à nous engager dans une démarche d'histoire, qu'elle soit globale, locale ou glocale, comme le mentionnait Margaret plus tôt, afin aussi de s'assurer que les populations marginalisées, fragilisées ou discriminées au fil des derniers siècles puissent y retrouver une place qui leur est due, donc une place importante et intégrée dans l'histoire de la musique. La première que je vais vous suggérer, eh bien, peut se faire en début de session, mais aussi tout au long de l'année, selon les sujets au programme. Et il s'agit donc de s'assurer d'avoir des moments où les étudiants peuvent s'exprimer de manière anonyme, que ce soit via des sondages ou encore par des nuages de mots, comme nous avons fait au début de la séance aujourd'hui. Eh bien, ça permet d'avoir un espace neutre où les étudiants peuvent exprimer et sans peur de rejet ou d'être jugés. Et bien sûr, une fois qu'un sondage comme celui-là est fait, par exemple, eh bien, il faut prolonger la discussion en classe en accompagnant les étudiants. Deuxièmement, eh bien, des lectures, des écoutes, c'est normal d'en faire, on en fait souvent dans des cours. Eh bien, ici, c'est de juste s'assurer que les étudiants, eh bien, à la fois aient le temps de pouvoir faire leurs lectures, leurs écoutes d'une manière individuelle, mais aussi d'y revenir en groupe, que ce soit en équipe ou encore en plénière en classe, afin de pouvoir assurer de les accompagner dans la confrontation qu'ils peuvent vivre à travers différents apprentissages. Pour l'histoire parallèle, j'y reviens dans un instant. Et en ce qui concerne la connexion locale, il s'agit d'encourager donc les professeurs de faire des liens avec la communauté dans laquelle s'inscrit l'université, que ce soit des artistes, que ce soit des gens de l'industrie, de différents milieux, donc afin d'aider les étudiants à pouvoir s'intégrer et s'inscrire dans l'univers auquel ils participent. Quant à l'activité en musique telle année, eh bien ici j'ai fait 1824 en musique il y a 2 ans avec des étudiants et je les ai vraiment juste invités donc à fouiller et arriver avec des événements musicaux qui avaient marqué cette année-là. Les premières données étaient très évidentes, en fait Beethoven, Chopin, Rossini. Ensuite j'ai invité à sortir un peu du canon. Alors on est arrivé avec une œuvre de Clara Schumann ou encore la naissance de Bedřich Smetana, mais il a fallu encore un peu plus d'efforts pour pouvoir offrir quelque chose de plus différent. Donc, par exemple, de l'apparition de la cueca chilienne ou encore la création de 5 écoles de musique militaire au Caire entre 1824 et 1834, ou encore le fait que c'est cette année-là que l'esclavage a cessé, donc la fin du commerce d'esclaves a pris fin au Canada. J'aborde maintenant l'évaluation des apprentissages. Le mot-clé à garder en tête, c'est flexibilité. Bien sûr, flexibilité qui va varier selon les contraintes et les ressources dont on dispose, mais néanmoins, de garder en tête qu'il faut tenter de s'adapter et d'offrir différentes formes d'évaluation. Ces évaluations-là doivent aussi refléter les transformations qu'on souhaite effectuer dans les cours, donc d'équité, diversité et d'inclusion, donc de pouvoir aussi pouvoir permettre aux étudiants n'ayant pas tous les mêmes niveaux, la même culture, le même bagage de connaissances, de pouvoir avoir une chance d'approfondir leur connaissance et leur apprentissage au sein du cours. Bien sûr, d'avoir quand même une rigueur, un niveau d'exigence qui va, dans le fond, encourager les étudiants à se surpasser, à se découvrir, à être engagés avec la matière du cours, mais selon des dispositifs qui peuvent être différents selon les points forts et les points faibles de chacun. Je poursuis en vous présentant à rafale quelques outils d'évaluation. Le premier, c'est la compilation ou la playlist. Il s'agit d'amener les étudiants à regrouper certains critères qui peuvent être préétablis, donc un ensemble de pièces musicales. Ceux-ci peuvent être réunis selon, par exemple, l'appartenance à une famille d'instruments, à une fonction, ou encore à une époque, à un lieu. Donc, c'est vraiment presque infini comme possibilité. Et les étudiants sont amenés aussi à décrire chacune des pièces en les liant à la thématique qui a été établie. Le guide d'écoute. Deuxième, eh bien, le guide d'écoute permet aux étudiants de ne pas se restreindre à la partition. Donc, pas un guide d'écoute qui va fonctionner nécessairement par mesure, mais vraiment de les ouvrir sur des phénomènes sonores auxquels leur oreille est soumise, et aussi d'en profiter pour faire des liens et des mises en contexte, que ce soit avec le type d'œuvre, le type d'apprentissage à l'oral ou à l'écrit, les types de publics ou non publics qui ont accès à cette œuvre-là, etc. Pour ce qui est de la dissertation, eh bien, le travail de recherche, j'aime mieux, plutôt que de demander une dissertation, de focuser davantage sur un plan de rédaction. C'est plus bref, concis, mais en même temps, ça demande une bonne exigence du côté de l'organisation des idées, de la structure, et c'est vraiment très, très instructif pour eux. Enfin, ils peuvent leur présenter leur travail de recherche dans le cadre d'un exposé oral. L'exposé oral qui doit demeurer flexible, c'est-à-dire que je demande aux étudiants de choisir entre une présentation en direct en classe ou encore de se préenregistrer et de déposer la vidéo sur le site du cours. Alors ainsi, les étudiants, même les plus réfractaires en début de session, sont très contents à la fin de celle-ci d'avoir acquis de nouvelles compétences transversales dans la communication orale en public. Je poursuis avec le portfolio d'apprentissage qui est mon préféré et que j'utilise dans presque tous mes cours. Le portfolio, c'est vraiment l'espace qui appartient aux étudiants, en fait l'espace qui permet de faire la jonction entre les intérêts de l'étudiant, son bagage, ses ressources personnelles et la matière du cours. Le portfolio inclut une introduction où les étudiants vont se présenter, dire quels sont ses objectifs d'apprentissage, quelles sont ses craintes et les défis auxquels il devra faire face. C'est aussi là où il peut rassembler des résumés des cours, des résumés des lectures au choix, donc en inscrivant un minimum, mais en laissant la liberté de choisir parmi les cours et les lectures ou les écoutes, mais c'est aussi l'espace pour avoir des entrées créatives. Un espace où ils peuvent faire des mini-recherches, ils peuvent composer, s'enregistrer, faire des entrevues, bref, vraiment de s'adapter et de rendre le cours signifiant pour eux. Avant de conclure, je me permets de donner un exemple d'examen. En fait, je recommande qu'au moins une fois dans la session qu'il y ait un examen maison. Un examen, donc, en dehors du contexte parfois plus stressant d'une classe avec un temps très limité. Donc, un examen maison qui peut se faire sur 2 à 3 jours et où les étudiants auront à la disposition toutes les ressources livresques qui peuvent découvrir. Donc, c'est vraiment un examen avec rigueur qui demande une sorte de recherche qui puise à la fois dans les notes et dans d'autres sources et qui fait preuve de flexibilité en offrant, par exemple, un choix de questions. Dans ce cas-ci, les étudiants avaient 4 questions présentées et devaient répondre à 3 d'entre elles. Voilà qui met fin à ma communication un peu longue, je m'en excuse, mais en terminant, j'aimerais donc revenir sur le fait que tout ce qu'on vous a présenté, mes collègues et moi, eh bien, demande du temps, demande de l'investissement. Donc, on ne vous fera pas de recettes secrètes avec ça, c'est exigeant. Et bien sûr, c'est pas tout le monde qui dispose des mêmes ressources matérielles et de temps pour pouvoir faire face à une transformation comme celle-là. C'est pourquoi toutes les trois, nous souhaitons donc dans un projet commun offrir des outils aux professeurs de niveau postsecondaire afin de pouvoir construire les cours, mais aussi d'offrir du matériel diversifié à leurs étudiants afin de pouvoir remettre en question le récit dominant qui est intégré dans les cours d'histoire et du coup pouvoir intégrer une vision plus décoloniale de la musique à travers les époques. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à tous. Thank you, everyone. Got some comments and so on in the chat. If you have questions, please write them in the chat. We're 34 people right now, which therefore goes on to a second screen. So I will, if you raise your hand, I will see some people and not others. So questions in the chat are great. You can pose your questions in English or French. To start off the discussion, I'm actually going to fold this back onto my colleagues and begin with the theme of our panel and indeed our emergent project, which we are hoping to get funding for. I think I can say that now because whatever decision has been made by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada has been made at this point. I'm not influencing anyone. We're just waiting to find out. But this idea of challenging the embedded coloniality, which can be done in so many ways. And I'm wondering, I'll do this in reverse order. Sandria, if you want to just pull a couple of things out of your experience in teaching that challenge this embedded coloniality. And then Linda after that.
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe I'll have many experience with this change that we want to do or we already made in our classes. Maybe I would just go back on what I just said in French a little bit. I think that a key way to go with the process of EDID in our class is the flexibility. Flexibility in the content that we present, also in the activities we do in class, and flexibility in the assessment. And of course, to do that without being too much work, right? Because sometimes we have class that can be they can be big. Of course, we need to have some guidelines that are very strict, but still, like with the learning portfolio I just explained, it's a really great way to do it. And the students really enjoy doing it. They can use a different form of platform on the internet. I use right now Tutory, but they can include different kind of materials, YouTube. We can also all collaborate on the same document. So what I did last semester, I decided for Baroque music to look at Baroque music from Latin America. So I created some entries and I invited the student to contribute to it. So it was very nice how we came up with some villancico music, zarzuela. We talked about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, so a wonderful poetess who was so much important. And before that, I just never heard about her. So it was just great. And they felt very, very compelled to participate. Like the active pedagogy was really good there. They could invest themselves and say, okay, we're creating something or we're participating to open our minds. So that was a really great experience. And I will let Linda pursue, but I was also talking about an activity that in English, it's called Think, Pair, Share. So when you ask a question or you read something that could be challenging, just to give time for everyone, and you can just take an alarm to calculate the time to say, okay, so everyone takes 5 minutes to just think about the question or the reading which is done or the listening which is done. Then just talk about one of your pairs, so in 2 or in 3 with the classmates, just to, they can, in a small group, just discuss about what they just read or understand and everything. And then we share in a big class. So which is nice because some students are not very comfortable to talk in front of the whole class, but they will be able to talk in a small group. So this is what I mean with by a flexibility. It's not everyone is going to be able to share their mind with the whole class. And then on the last slide, I was talking about assessment. And yet again, I think it's really important to give the opportunity to students to construct with things that they knew or they want to know more about. I have one example. I have a student who is very religious. He's Christian. He wanted to talk about the Gregorian chant. But it happens that he has a brother who is Jewish and lives in Israel. And he decided to focus actually and to work on that particular fact that at the same moment in their history, there's different notation in different religious songs. So his history music class gave him an occasion to reach out with his brother and talk about it. And his brother recorded some religious chant in Hebrew. And he presented that in our class, saying, here's the notation and how it works. So it was a really great experience for her to have this experience being shared and for him too. So he reflected on that in his portfolio, saying, music and music history finally helped me to reach out with, I don't know his complex history with his brother, but it was just kind of a great moment. And he learned also with that, and he made his classmates learn about music that wasn't Gregorian chant in the same era. So I will stop here for now.
Thank you. And Linda, do you want to share something?
Sure. So I teach in a program, a liberal arts university that is focused on, an art music curriculum. So doing this type of work has been presented its own challenges, both within the school and also within my own syllabi. So often I find in the narratives that we have received, this the narratives sort of portray art music in Europe as this pure object that is sort of a little bit devoid from its social and political context, at least in the sort of standard text. So one thing that I've tried to do this semester, this year and moving forward will continue to do, is to put that art music within that context. And colonialism is a way of doing that. If you look at a mass that was used for conversion in colonial lands, that really changes the narrative around the function and the purpose of a mass. For example, if you consider it in Rome, and it's just a blanket statement, this is what a mass is, this is what it looks like, this is what it does, here's the text, the Kyrie is Greek, everything else is in Latin, you're sort of avoiding that context. And so that's one thing I found really helpful. And another thing, just to follow up on my own talk, that as I was watching it, I was like, well, come on, Linda, you talked about challenging these narratives, but you never actually gave us an example of one that you challenged or something that you learned coming out of it. And so I thought of a good example that ties in with what Sandria was just talking about. So like an embedded narrative that is, frequently transmitted is this idea of rupture at 1600 in Italy, with opera emerging and this revolutionary change at this moment in time in this location, really centering Europe and centering 1600 as this moment of the Baroque beginning. And we have continuo music and dramatic music, and they've gone and looked to the Greeks and they've reinvented expression, and everything has changed. But when you consider music in other locations, you realize that these changes unfold in different times and in different ways and at different speeds and in unique ways and nuanced ways. And so that is one of the narratives that was disturbed when we looked at music from different locations around the same time period, is that narrative just didn't hold water anymore. And so we just talked about different types of changes instead of teaching that narrative. They weren't reading that text that told that narrative, or if they did, it was one of 4 or 5 different views and perspectives that was presented. So I thought I think that's a pretty firm example, and that's probably what I should have put in that presentation as well. So I'm glad to have the chance to bring that now. And I just want to note, Margaret, that there were instructions given prior, asking people to put comment and not to put their questions in the chat. So some people, like Jürgen Torup, have put comment in and not asked a question. And I think then we need to decide how to proceed, just so that everybody knows what they're supposed to do.
I missed I've missed a lot of things here. So yeah, please put questions in the chat as well as comments. I'll read out some comments because they won't be on the recording. But also you can use, if you click on the participants little thing at the bottom, there's a place there to raise your hand, and we will be able to see that. So I just follow up on my question in my own courses. The main thing that I try to do in my courses is to expose the narrative and the historiography, where the narrative came from, and also talk about what historians do. Because in music history particularly, we tend to talk about history as if it's just something that happened, rather than something that somebody wrote, somebody told. And all histories come from somewhere. And what historians do, of course, is to, look through the evidence. I talk a lot about the silences in the archive, what ends up in the archive, what doesn't end up there, and then who accesses the archive, and so on. So talking about how history is created, historical fact versus historical interpretation. But it's what Sandria was saying about survey your students and listen to your students. I use discussion boards, and I've also gone back to grading my own exams the TA can do the papers and whatnot, and I do the exams, because in the exam questions, you can see what they've learned and what they haven't learned. And I put the evolutionary narrative right on the table, and then I'm just like floored to suddenly read in a discussion post, I'm so grateful to Dr. Walker for teaching us about the evolution of music. And like, no, don't do that. So realizing what came across in the wrong way. Now, Judith Cohen has put in about her MA thesis and music in medieval Iberia. I think Iberia and Andalusia is key in troubadour music and in all kinds of other things. And it's not in the textbooks. And then Emmanuel has written about the Music Crosswords International. So this backs up my assertion that this material is out there. And this is what we hope to do in this SSHRC-funded project is to start finding things and sort of annotating them and making them more available for people who want to do different things in their music history classroom. Does anyone have a bibliography of music history books that are not about European music? The best thing I can suggest right now, and I think I'm going to get the name wrong, is the Inclusive Early Music bibliography. Is that right, Linda? Yes, and there are Robin Elliott's
put it in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Linda, very much. Reinhard Strom's edited collection, Studies on a Global History of Music. There are actually 3 edited collections from that project of Reinhard's, which I had the privilege to be a part of. There's the inclusiveearlymusic.org link there. But yes, this is, I think, a huge issue about counteracting this narrative in the classroom, is that all of the history and everything they find on the internet, and it gives the same narrative over and over again, and finding material. And I don't think the answer is yet another textbook. Somebody in another talk I was giving said, well, Margaret, aren't you going to write a textbook now? And like, no, because it's always going to leave something out. It will create a new canon. And I think more of like the Inclusive Early Music bibliography, that type of an iterative and living archive, or living archive is the wrong word, like a nexus of information, so people can think, okay, like Sandria did about what happened in 1824. Okay, I'm teaching music in the 18th century, and what are the various entangled and relational histories that I can draw in, so that it's not just about Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. I'm going back up in the chat. Please keep your microphone muted. Oh, there's so much in here. Yes, so I'm just going to read this out for the recording from Judith. It has been common to include the one composition by Troubowitz known as Comtesse de Dia in music history textbooks. However, they typically only include one stanza and don't discuss the lyrics. I discuss it at length in my MA thesis on women musicians in the 3 religions of medieval Iberia. And that's from 1980, if somebody wants to go and find that. Judith, I don't know whether it's available on if you've got a ResearchGate or academia.edu. And then Emmanuel, I like the effort by Music Crosswords International to transcribe music from African musicians to produce an African real book for use in music education in Africa.
Margaret?
Yep.
Jürgen Torp, I think, would like to unmute and ask a question.
Oh, please.
He's tried several times to do that, and he's raising his hand.
Please, Jürgen, go ahead.
Yes, okay, a comment, a larger comment. You're very concentrating on music history education, and there are, of course, a few questions. One, whether you have one, or the accessibility. Well, in many places you have no education system that is made for doing that. Then the question is what the special education system allows and what it asks for. And normally, if you only have the traditional history, music, education, there is not much what you can do without having another starting point. And so my experience as I was changed from historic musicology to systematic musicology was then the final output was my PhD, and that is old Atlantic tangos, rhythmic figurations in changing times and cultures, finished in 2006 or so, 15 years of work, and it is about 19th century history, not 20th, 19th century, and you see the little a picture that is a black woman who plays a drum instrument in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And the tangos were a complex of musics in Spain, in Cuba, in Brazil, and perhaps the word is of African origin, so it is very in this trans-cultural context, written in the trans-cultural, and it is a part of music history, of course. But then this is the other thing. You need, of course, a language, and this is in German, and then you have no audience to listen or to read it. And of course, also for the student, it is important whether the material is accessible or not. And then, of course, you need a lot of luck or relations, whether I can go to Buenos Aires or to the places and do the research there and speaking the languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. But the real problem then is if you have such a big topic, I would say, you need the context. And the context in global history, global music history is the history and the music. And there is a kind of, in the history, the history writers, the historians were often not able to handle the mess of music research because you need special understanding for that. And so just in the last, I would say 10 years or so, there are much more having cultural music parts in history books. And the other part is that you, as a musicologist, normally have not enough understanding for the historical circumstances. And that is why you need to do real history studies. And that is the problem often of the, you cannot write a music history just from the musical notes that exist, or from the recordings or whatever. And you need, especially if it comes to questions like colonialism and decolonizing, you need a lot of context. And the context you can only get if you are more educated in the history writing, or in the writing of histories. I would also the plural of, use the plural of that.
Thank you.
Okay, finally ending.
No, that you've brought up a number of very, very important points, and one of them is definitely languages, and non-European languages. I mean, we cycle around saying, oh, well, we should be able to read German and French and Italian, and of course, those are the languages of this epistemological myopia, languages outside of Europe, multilingual histories, and I think research teams are key in that. The other important thing that you brought up is this music history versus history, and I remember two short stories. One piano student I was teaching back in 2009, who was a history and music, like a double major. And I asked her about, well, what do you do in first year history in the real history department? And she said, no, we don't. We just learn theories of history for the first year. And then after that, we start looking at histories, knowing how they were written. And me and my musicologist, ethnomusicologist naivety thought, what? Theories of history? Like, well, we don't do that at all. And then I also got in one of my course evaluations in a team taught drama and music history course that I was teaching. Somebody wrote on it, I thought this was a history course, not a music history course. And I thought, oh, let's think about that one. So yeah, great points. There's another a really good comment in the chat here from Andri. I don't know if I just mispronounced your name. I'm sorry. I think one of the barriers to such a move, meaning decolonizing and moving outside of the canon, is comfort on the part of the instructor. Yeah, absolutely. That's why we're talking about discomfort. It's easier to know a lot about the history of one culture, say European elite, but the model of opening it up might feel like the instructor needs to feel competent in 100 cultures that the student might be interested in. How to deal with that? Can we teach when we're not experts ourselves? And I would say, and I'll let Linda respond to that in a minute, but so my master's was in musicology, but then my doctorate was in ethnomusicology. And as we know, my father used to say, doing a doctorate is knowing more and more about less and less. So you end up like this. But as an ethnomusicologist, you end up teaching everything. I mean, a world music survey course, suddenly you have to stand up there and talk about music in Korea and music in the Caribbean, even if these aren't your specialties. And learning how to learn, I think, is what we all do as researchers. So I'm comfortable outside of my comfort zone, but I understand how if somebody has come through in Europe elite music, that even talking about jazz or popular music can suddenly feel really nebulous. And I think that that's something we have to embrace. But Linda, you wanted to comment on that one.
Yeah, I really like this comment. So thank you, Andri, for adding that. My take on that is that, and having gone through my recent changes, I felt very much like that, and I talk about that in the presentation. And my take on that is that this idea of us needing to be experts in our field and to know, as you say, like 100% of the material to feel completely competent in exactly what you're teaching, that might be one of our embedded pedagogical narratives that we inherit from our teachers and from our education. So that is a structural dimension of training in European art music, be it in performance, right? The emphasis on perfection is there. Be it in music history, there's an emphasis on perfection there to a degree that might prevent us from feeling comfortable expanding outwards. And so, I don't know what Lydia Gurr would say, but if I apply what I understand from her theory, that would be another invisible aspect of this canonic teaching and pedagogy, is that we are bound to it because it's what we know, and it's a limited amount of material that we can own completely. And that concept of owning material is also an embedded colonial narrative. So that's why I got really excited by your comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Sandria.
Yeah, if I may, I think now I'm thinking in a way that maybe something that will make a difference between global music history and trying to decolonize a music history class is that it would depend on where you are. I think we have to have in mind that we maybe not decolonize the music history course if in the same way if we are in Canada or in Africa, in Korea. So I think we have to keep in mind what we want to do, because we have a population, we have students that are not the same. Everyone doesn't have the same background. So I think here maybe there's something different between a decolonized classroom and a global music classroom. And I understand also from the comment that being not comfortable, it's true that there are some we have to take care of, not just repeat some not accurate information about other cultures' music, because it's sometimes what can happen when you have to teach about so many other things that you actually not expert to, you never learn. So how do you learn that? When you learn to learn, is that you're going to find some materials that you're going to read and think, okay, I think this is accurate enough so I can tell that to my student. So how knowing that actually what you're telling would be something that the people you're talking to will say, okay, this represents my culture and my music. So I would, I have some backgrounds in French Canadian and also Haitian backgrounds. And there's so many horrible things that doesn't fit the culture of Haiti and French Canadian. So, of course, there is something there that is very difficult. And again, to repeat, I think that is why our project is important, because what we want to do is try to find not only the three of us, but find either other experts when we're not experts, to find some material that is, accurate to talk about others' music, so that we can learn from those texts, articles, chapters, books, and everything, and we can also give them to our student. So yeah, this was my comment.
Yeah, I think part of this also can be addressed by inviting guests into your class, reaching out to the experts. But another thing, in a way, we talk about being an expert, and yet we end up being an expert in replicating the canon, which I think is what Linda was saying. The other thing, too, when we talk about our music and others' music, I mean, for me to say that the music of 18th century Austria is somehow my music, it's not, right? I'm British Isles largely. There's a little bit of German and French in there, supposedly from family stories, but it's mostly just English. So that's not my music any more than all kinds of other things. So, but this is what I mean by the hegemony of the canon and the embeddedness of the canon. It's sitting up there as this kind of universal thing, that this is our music, and in a way it's not. There's a wonderful comment here from Solomon. In Zimbabwe, we teach the history of Western music, yet we are not experts in Western music. Unfortunately, we don't teach the history of our own music. It's so disappointing.
Yeah, but I have something to say about that.
Please.
Yeah, I really wouldn't say we don't teach history of our music. We do. Actually, the school curriculum provides for that. But unfortunately, the resources are scarce. That's the only challenge we have. We don't have written materials. We have to scrounge around. I did research in 2018 in rural Zimbabwe, 2017, 2018, trying to gather information on the history of Zimbabwean music. This is all an effort to try to gather materials for the classroom. It doesn't mean we don't teach it.
Thank you. No, and this question of materials, who writes history and when and for whom, I think is really key. I think we're a small enough group right now that if you want to make a comment, you can turn on your microphone. I don't think we're going to have chaos, so please feel free. I'll continue reading in the chat. Robin Elliott says, there is being not comfortable because our knowledge base is not sufficient to teach global music history, and being not comfortable because we feel guilty of replicating tourist culture and sampling music from all different eras and places. And it's hard to discriminate between these discomforts. And yes, I agree. I think that the first step is to put those things out there and recognize them, own them. If anybody has any suggestions about how they've dealt with that would be great. Colette says, I find myself concentrating more and more on teaching historiography and other structures of the disciplines, musicology, ethnomusicology, and less concerned on covering content. This has been really transformative for the students. It's a challenge for first year courses. Colette, that's one of the things that I found. I mean, if you want to drag something good about it, the pandemic and all the remote teaching, was one of the sort of survival pieces of information, survival for the professors and also the students that we got from our Center for Teaching and Learning when we all went remote and online was do less content. And I found that amazingly liberating in my music history courses, that I didn't have to go through this, the textbook says to do this, and then it says to do this. I made the textbook optional. I got rid of the scores. And suddenly, you're saying, okay, it's the 18th century. What am I going to say? The American Revolution. How am I going to deal with that? Hey, I'm in Kingston in Canada. It's loyalist country. Who are the local loyalists? And we have the Mohawks of the Tyendinaga Reserve who came north after the American Revolution. And so I connected with a colleague who gave me a musical, who teaches Mohawk, who is Mohawk from Quinte, gave me a musical example, and we had him in as a guest from the class. So there you have the local people, Indigenous people, but within this larger global setting. So yeah, I found that let's throw the content out the window, and then what shall we put back in? Now I've got to figure out how to do that when I'm back in the classroom and not get nasty things on my course evaluations. Colonialism suppressed oral traditions in Africa. I think colonialism suppressed oral traditions everywhere, Dorothy. That's such a great comment. Thank you. Yes, and in Europe's many cultures too. Martin Stokes has a chapter, I'm trying to think which collection it's in, that talks about European music. There's like a Europe 1, which is the elite culture, and then Europe 2, which are all of the other cultures, and some of them very marginalized and with their languages have been colonized and marginalized, and all these other issues that we run into all over the world as well. I think one of the things also is to, this is going to sound a little odd, but to ethnicize Europe and to ethnicize European art music. That this is the music of Central Europe. And if you look at the folk music of Central Europe, and you can connect things like Ländler with Brahms and say this is as ethnic as anything else. Suibing, you had a question earlier in the chat. Do you want to just turn on your microphone? And the chat is like going bit, and I'm losing track of it. My apologies.
Okay, yeah. No, my question is about global music history that is often taught separately from Western art or Western classical music. So I would like to ask whether are there any initiatives to combine both in one course? And also, are there other initiatives to include Indigenous people's music history in the classroom? If there are, then what are the responses from the students?
So that's I'll answer that briefly, and then Linda. That is actually what I've been trying to do in my classes. I'm probably about half and half in the most recent class I took. It's difficult to know what the responses from the students are because of the remote situation. The return on the student evaluations was quite low. And maybe the students who loved the course filled out the evaluations because they seem to really like it. But yeah, I think that's the big challenge is to teach music history, to figure out how to do that. And I don't have an easy answer. Judith.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to point out that actually there have been quite a few old school textbooks long before online courses or hybrid courses that tried to at least integrate, like to get away from the idea that it's only European Western art music, elite class, etc., music history. Joseph Kerman did it, even 20 years ago in his Listen textbook. It was a try, and it was, mostly Western art music history with little bits of kind of token world music stuck in at the end of every chapter, but it was a beginning and it was an acknowledgement. And one of the textbooks that I've used actually quite successfully is Music as Social Experience. And I don't like everything they do and say and choose, but their idea is world or global music and jazz and popular music and Western art music are all just, different terrific traditions. And what they do is they organize the book in terms of concepts. So music and gender, music and nationalism, music and spirituality. And they include roughly the same number of examples from all these different sources, and they don't privilege one or the other. They don't at all say, Western art music is the real music and all these are the para musics. They don't do that. And as I said, I think it's flawed and there's problems with it, but the approach and the idea, and also in music ed, Patricia Campbell, for years and years and years, has been doing the same thing. She's been using Western art music as one terrific tradition among many terrific traditions, not the tradition, not the real music. And I think we need to go back and maybe reevaluate and rethink and see what the best is of these approaches that we can adapt and we can use instead of always reinventing the entire wheel. We can reinvent the wheel, but we need to see what other wheels. I'm terrible at metaphors. I mix them all the time. I see Linda laughing at me and I see Emmanuel laughing at me. Go ahead, laugh. I laugh at myself all the time. But you know what I mean? Instead of just dumping everything and this new paradigm of everything to do with the wicked, evil West and colonizers and so on is bad. It's not. There's terrific stuff and there's terrific people, and why don't we instead, do what my mother used to say, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and really try and pull out the best of what our colleagues have done in the not so distant past, in the past 30, 40 years, and are still doing, evaluate it, see what we can work with. And, that's it. I just wanted to say that.
No, completely agree. And one of the places I'm coming from is having taught like music and society through thematic approach. But then what I found surveying my students was that they were putting that into one bucket, like this is about culture. But then when we do history, this music has a history. Yeah. So they're trying to weave those things. And
I just wanted to add one thing. We do have to be careful because the problem is, as I wrote in the chat, that in, up until maybe the late 19th century, even later, most of this music was not written down in notation. We can say how notation does not serve, most music cultures. It's true it was developed for a certain music culture, but the fact does remain that, for example, extrapolating from global music traditions to early music history is only of limited use because they change. Like my specialty is Sephardic music, and I give whole workshops about why it's not medieval music. So we also have to be careful about romanticizing and saying, well, you can look at this or that tradition and it must have been like that in the 13th or 14th or 15th century, because definitely. Elements of it probably were, but we don't know which ones. So we also have to, reevaluate and be careful about that whole approach. And I just wanted to add, I've mostly been teaching in non-music major programs. And in those programs, at least at York, there are a lot of students from, say, China or Russia who have really strong Western art music backgrounds, but their major is something else. Their major might be, computer science or kinesiology or engineering. And very often their perspectives are much more open than the music major perspective. So I think we might also want to think about integrating classes and not having so many music major courses and non-music major courses.
Yeah, completely on board. But Solomon's been waiting a while, so please.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. I'm the one who said in Zimbabwe we don't teach our own history in terms of music, and I was referring to courses offered in universities. I studied ethnomusicology when I was doing my undergraduate degree. Unfortunately, we didn't do anything to do with Zimbabwean music history and even African music history. But we covered a lot of stuff in terms of Western music history, even the periods, for example, Baroque, classical period, and everything. But when it comes to our own music, we do not even have written sources. We do not have systematic courses to do with Zimbabwean and African music in general. So that is why I was saying we do not teach history of music. even in schools, yes, I agree that we offer something related to music history, but for me, I don't see that as history. It's like we are teaching colonialism, because even the way we demarcate the historical periods, for example, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, and the way the information is structured according to those periods, it's more of we are dealing with colonialism. For example, the impact, the effects of colonialism on music history. It's not history, but we are teaching colonialism. That's my own understanding of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That goes back to, I forget whose comment it was about the place that we are and where, who, yeah, each one of us or each group of us, where are you teaching? And the history that we teach and the struggles, the barriers in a Canadian university versus in a Zimbabwean university versus in a Russian university, you know, like there are different stories here. All the more reason to try to pick apart this idea that there's this one story that is the important one. So thank you very much, Solomon. Anyone else want to join the fray here? We've got great ideas.
Is waiting.
Sorry?
Hi.
I think Emmanuel is waiting.
Hello.
And then Javier after that.
Yeah, Emmanuel speaking. Right, thank you very much for the presentations and the questions coming up. This is very interesting. Actually, I happen to be one of the people who was sitting in the forum that prepared the Zimbabwe schools music syllabus for the first time in 2004. Before that, the schools were using the BRSM, or the ABRSM, the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, or the Cambridge examinations. So, yeah, as Solomon has said, it's true. Yes, we, as I've said before, we struggle with resources, but we teach the history of Zimbabwean music. The only challenge is that, of course, we use terms like pre-colonial, post-colonial, which is not, I wouldn't say we are teaching colonialism. We are actually just informing, right? We are giving information to the students so that they decide which, because basically we are looking at decolonization. And so we say our music was like this before the whites came, then it became this during the colonial period, and now it's moving towards this. But anyway, the most important thing I want to talk about is in relation to Tan's question. I wanted to say there's a lot to learn in Africa when it comes to decolonization. Although, of course, the Africans have been kind of being combative when it comes to decolonization. But you find that education-wise, they've taken a route where they are not throwing away Western music, no. But they are kind of integrating Western music and African music, right, at different degrees. If any one of us here would care to study curriculums in Africa, across Africa, you'll be surprised to what extent Africans have integrated Western music and African music, of course, in different degrees. But I want to tell you the truth. You will learn more than you'd ever expect. There are many of us here who think that such a thing has never happened. But in Africa, there's always somewhere where we have a curriculum where there's a balance between Western and African music. Especially in Zimbabwe, they've taken strides to make sure that, I'm talking about the school's curriculum. Universities differ. We have different programs. Solo was talking of the Great Zimbabwe University. It's a different program from what is offered at the Zimbabwe College of Music. It's a different program from what is offered at Africa University, whose base is in the United States. So we have these different programs. But basically what I'm saying is, if we all want to see how Western music can be integrated with African music, please read and study African curriculums. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to put that title in the chat just so people see it? This is why I love this concept of entangled histories. It's such an evocative word for me. Not parallel, relational, but histoire causée. This crisscrossing of influences and the idea that there are pure music somewhere. I don't know about that. Javier, did you have a question?
Yeah, more than a comment. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's very helpful since I am an ethnomusicologist teaching music history, like I think many of him, or the one here are doing the same. So, but several comments. First is about the expert. I think we think we are maybe we are not expert on every music culture or every content, but we are expert in thinking critically. So we can. That's the point. So if we think that we need to be expert to teach something, we cannot teach, for example, world music. If you only see for example, the Mike Bagan textbook, you cannot be expert on all those music cultures to teach that, but you can use it as a textbook. But so you're not expert in a culture or in a music tradition, you can think critically about that. Music, I connect with Solomon thing about the school curriculum. I am teaching for future music teachers, so we are a little bit restrained for who the school curriculum is asking you for the future teachers to know about music history. So actually it's been very important because the school curriculum in Chile, I'm from Chile, they introduce popular music, traditional music from the original peoples. So we in the new program that my university is running, we will have like two subjects for one: global music 1 and global and local music 1 and global music 2. So one is going to be regarded about Latin American music and the other about Chilean music. So we are going to, the solutions that we get here is like we are going to run a parallel one, like one focus in Western music and the other one focus on, that's the solution that we can get partially. But in the meantime, it's important, many of you said about the survey students. A very good practice that has result with my student is like it's been working. It's like when they make essays or monographies about some topics, they can link with some practices that they are aware of. For example, one of the students are talking about the minstrels, the perception about the minstrels, like the textbook says, but about what happened with the street musician in Puerto Montt in this city, or what happened with the trovadores from Europe and the trovadores from Cuba or from Latin America. So I think the how to decolonize the curriculum or the context, maybe the student have the right answer. So I think being focused on the new learning outcomes rather than the content, I think the student can help us how to connect with the new things. As a music teacher, always my friends from my age they say, hey, how do you know about all this stuff? Thanks to my students. My students know everything about what is happening now. We are too old to know what happened on the street, what happened on MTV, or what happened on other places. So I think survey student is I think is a very important tip that you gave. Thank you.
The most recent course that I took, was, this is answer to Judith's question a little bit, co-taught with drama, because we're a school of drama and music. And also the Bachelor of Music students have to take it, but it's open to everyone. So it puts them into this milieu. And the title of it is Listening to Revolutions. And so we picked revolutions through the centuries, class revolutions. Let's see if I can get this. Class revolutions, which was the early 1700s, political revolutions, which was American Revolution and French Revolution, which is what I alluded to with the Mohawk hymn. National revolutions. We skipped Beethoven, by the way, hop over Beethoven, in spite of his presence in the word cloud. And artistic revolutions, the turn of the 20th century, post-colonial revolutions, which one of the examples was Zimbabwe and Thomas Mapfumo. And then anti-colonial revolutions, where we did Black Lives Matter and Idle No More. And so suddenly I was presenting Beyonce. And yeah, talk about being out of your comfort zone. I have never felt so out of my comfort zone at any point as presenting to my students music that they knew far, far better than me. But yeah, it made me happy to be a historian. Like I want to go back into my archives, not try to teach them what they already know. But they loved it. They were really happy to be there. Sandria.
Well, so yeah, this is a very interesting discomfort. I mean, I'm more used to this one because I also teach popular music history. Actually, it's my usually main area of research. So often I was teaching pop music or jazz, and the student knew a lot more than me. When I covered like heavy metal, I knew a little bit, but not as much as others. So this way of having to bond with students and say, okay, we're going to learn together. I might tell you how we can put that music into context and how it was related with the music industry and the people and the political, social context and everything. But the music itself, I mean, they knew more than me, and we can have a really great discussion about that. So I think we can do the same thing with students that have different background in our class, and or even if they knew something and it's not related to their background, just because they are kind of an expert in their own in such kind of music. Or so I think, yeah, we have to have a way for them to pursue that knowledge that they are accumulated a little by little. And yeah, that's why I think it's really interesting to have this flexibility to make sure that they will be encouraged to go further into their learning. Yeah.
Actually, I think one of the key questions is, why are we teaching music history? Not just because the Paris Conservatoire decided to put it in the curriculum in 1871. But why? Because so many of my students will, if you ask them why are we studying music history, why is everybody, they'll say, because it helps me play my instrument better. It helps me sing better. If I know Mozart's biography, then I will perform Don Giovanni better. Which I'm completely unconvinced by, but it might take a big study to figure out with actual performers whether this helps them. But then beyond that, like, why do it? And my answer would be, because the narrative is so embedded, we have to call it out and pick it apart. But I'm actually interested what people think. Why is it necessary that we teach history, music history or other histories? Yeah, Thomas.
I think it's mainly about understanding musical processes and why music is written the way it is written, or being formed as it is formed, under the influence of politics, religion, geography, right? So a curriculum that would focus on such thematic steps, music and interaction with politics, music and interaction with religion, that would make sense. That opens the doors to bring examples from any culture. But then also it might, so if I learn the traditional music of my home, and it looks very Indonesian here, yeah, but I'm half an hour away from Salzburg, right? So my traditional music is Mozart and Haydn. So and everyone is now saying, yeah, let's Mozart away. So I grew up in my primary school time and I sang Mozart songs and I didn't know it was Mozart. Yeah. So it brings us back also to maybe to your question, does it help me to sing Mozart better if I know the biography of Mozart and the circumstances where Mozart has been living in? And that would be the same question of how has this Javanese gamelan been developed under the influence of the sultanates, of the money givers, of the central radio station of Indonesia, right? To understand the musical processes. And I think if we go along those processes, we will get a really, really good curriculum. Right? And I don't know if any one of you is familiar with the music curriculum of the International Baccalaureate, this system of the international schools. They are just starting this year to introduce the new curriculum and the new assessment system. And they require from the teachers to go along these thematic thoughts, the areas of investigation, and then in a more regional question, the students will have to compare always 3 levels. That is, number 1, the personal level, the music that I am filled with, that's happening in front of my house door. Number 2, the regional level, that would mean for me Middle Europe, yeah. But I have been teaching in the IB curriculum in Singapore, that would mean Southeast Asia, yeah. And number 3, global. And then always make comparisons. How are the musical processes between those levels? How does music and politics, this topic, affect me personally, affect my area, affect the world? And then, I mean, there's a great connection point of us ethnomusicologists also to collaborate with the curriculum creators, maybe even come in as examiners, right? To advise teachers in their teaching, to advise the curriculum development. And then, and then demystify the whole elite thing of Mozart and Beethoven, because Mozart's job was to compose. He didn't die very elitist. You know, he was thrown in a bag. Yeah, and we have to demystify also this thought of the European elitist classical music, because the composers themselves did not want to do that. They wanted everyone to go into the opera house and listen to their operas. And just the money givers were the royalty, right? And if you look at this Javanese gamelan, right? You don't find this in the village. You find it at the palaces. This is an elitist Indonesian gamelan set. Also, in the different cultures, we will find again social levels where music is elitist, and we find music that's being more played by the middle class and by the lower class. So we have to maybe find different lines where we draw separations. Yeah.
Yes, about the question you just asked, I wanted to answer in 2 ways. The first way is that maybe we have to let the student think about that themselves. Actually, this is the question I asked them to answer in the introduction. How can you make this course being significant for your studies and for what you want to do in your life? And there's many answers that will show up. But I think that, to go back from what Mr. Javier said, I think it's one of the few spaces where they can think critically about something that they are passionate for, music. Some other teacher could do it, but I think music history class is a way how you can do that. Actually, you can teach them to do that. And so a way where students can learn about the human history. I mean, where what happened in the world. And so this is why it's crucial to have this discussion today, because we're teaching them a way to think about the world, of course, through the lens of music, but still that's the way they're going to see themselves related to the past, their present and future. So this is really, really important. But then I would say, ask the student what they can do, like saying, okay, you don't have a choice to do that course. So how can you make sure that you're going to go take great thing from that course for yourself? And just go back to the flexibility, how you can make your assessment and your activities in class being, meaningful.
So Tom Peterson has just put a good point in the chat. The other, there is this other thing about doing global music history generally, which is that we have to question how appropriate Western understandings of what music is actually are. Yeah, so I mean, the what is music question is a good standard ethno question that I've put in my music history classes now, because what music is in 21st century Canada and what music is in Indigenous communities and what music was ontologically in medieval Europe or wherever. Sorry, I just got off topic. When we're considering historic non-Western musics, and I would say historic Western musics as well, definitely. Music in the West is often thought of as being art and self-expression. Yeah, my students will come out with that. Music is whatever the individual. And then you point out, no, individuality is very much of this time and place. Historically in South Asia, singing has been a medium for telling history or meeting communal spiritual needs. Definitely, yeah. I think the ontologies of music need to be on the table as well. So we have 2 minutes left. And of course, as it often happens when in panels like this, the discussion takes off with 2 minutes to go. But I'm actually, I'm going to ask if anyone has any last minute. I'm also going to point out that you can save the chat. At the bottom of the chat panel, there are the 3 little dots. If you click on that, you can save the chat if you want to save some of the wonderful, insightful comments, but also some of the resources that have turned up there. I see Carlos, who is our wonderful tech person. Thank you for your help, Carlos, on this. And yeah, I'm going to take the last 2 minutes to thank people. Thank you all for such a wonderful, robust discussion. May the discussion continue. May the dialogue continue. I'm delighted we have such an international dialogue going on here. And in spite of the time shift thing, which I'm going to blame on things to do with daylight savings and things like that. Thank you, Soy Beng, for the wonderful initiative of the dialogues on this topic. Thank you, Sandria and Linda. I'm reading more excellent comments in the chat. European music and dance is not only about art music, absolutely. So, yes, thank you all again. It's noon where I am, and so I'm going to go have some lunch. And so I wish you a good day, good breakfast, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Margaret and everybody. That was a great discussion. Thanks so much.